So let me begin by showing the size of the problem we are facing. And imagine this is a very stylized model. We have three types of city: medium, large, and mega. They're squares. They have blocks, as you can see in the table. They start as they grow, the size grows to build BRT, eventually metro. Of course, local roads. Local roads provide the capillarity, the access to houses, to buildings, to properties. It's the ultimate capillarity that a city needs. And of course, some expressways and arterial roads are needed. Now, the model also considers maintenance, preventive, routine, and of course, capital investments. I want to highlight that the slopes of the curves you're seeing in the slide. Capital investment has a downward slope. Think about it. Maintenance, all the maintenance has upward slopes. We'll get back to that, why the slopes are like that. But the model reflects to catch up, to invest in capital, in other words, and maintain and operate the transport system from the sidewalk to the subway precisely. And here are the results for over 20 years, added up, no discount rate, no need. Any discount rate won't change much. So, but it's capital, operation, and maintenance for the three types of cities. And you can see two things from the slide. One, as the city grows, the total cost of the transport system seems to explode. And I know soon you will have Alain Berthaud speaking here, and I hope he will address this. And it will be very interesting because, yes, cities, it's not that they're becoming more inefficient. It costs more because the infrastructure is growing proportionally to the area, which is squared. But cities do embed the scale economies, all the advantages of location of cities, the market they are. So despite seeing the cost of transport increase exponentially, don't feel bad, cities continue to be a good idea. The second thing I want to highlight is the green bar, which is local roads. And this was a surprise when we developed the model, and then we validated the model. I will show that in the next slide, that local roads are so expensive. But it's because there are thousands of kilometers lane, let me go back, of local roads. Look for a mega city, 200,000 kilometers lane of local roads. And local roads are therefore an inherent part of the asset management structure for any urban transport system. And they're often forgotten. And when I say roads, I also include, of course, the sidewalk. It's not only the road. We include in the model the cost of the sidewalks. And data for Bogota. On the left, you see the distribution in kilometers lane. It matches more or less what our model predicted. Bogota has a very extensive network of BRT. The arterial network, again, kilometer lanes, and a somewhat underdeveloped intermediate and local, particularly the local streets. And this is because a large chunk of Bogota has urbanized through informal settlements. Roads are difficult to build in high slope areas, a myriad of factors. But again, the cost is actually quite high. I'm referring now to the right part of the slide, particularly the rightmost set of bars. That's the cost of bringing up to like a decent state of repair the road network, completing what has not been built, and operating and maintaining over 20 years. And the left part in the slide, in the figure on the right, completing the arterial network and bringing it to a good state of repair is actually quite expensive. But Bogota, we have an ancillary paper, this is not mentioned in the actual book I'm presenting today, has a strategy of emphasizing maintenance in the BRT network above all, and then in the arterial roads. That's the strategy, to finance the part that provides the larger mobility. The local roads are a little bit behind, are lagging behind, but Bogota, like many other cities in the developing world, cannot finance all the costs of the transport system. And we call this the underfunding or underfinancing trap. We argue in the book that cities fall in a trap, meaning they don't have the revenue or the sources of revenue to finance all the infrastructure they need to add, bringing all the infrastructure to the level of maintenance it should have, and operating all the infrastructure. And maintenance, think of the slopes of the slide I was showing beforehand. And you will see the dotted line on the top, the orange one, is actually the aspirational spending that Bogota has according to the plans and the master mobility strategies and plans and so on. And it's a huge investment, but it never materializes. It's the line below it. And on the bottom side of the slide, you see the dotted line in green, and that one is what we call the trap. It's not only the deficit, it goes beyond, because what it will cost to put the system up to par, to build all the capital again and maintain properly the infrastructure, is way more expensive than what the city has. Back to this, the slide I presented with the slopes. As cities build transport infrastructure and manage to to overcome their financing trap, then capital investment over a long time has a downward slope because they need to invest less in capital, add less kilometers of BRT, less kilometers of mass transit, and so on. They have already invested in the capital. But operation and maintenance has an upward slope because the respective costs go up. As you have more infrastructure, you have to maintain more. Many cities in the developing world are in the left part of the slide in a trap where they cannot undertake the much needed capital investments in more BRT, in more metro, in more sustainable transport, sidewalks and local streets included, and they cannot even maintain properly the assets they already have. They are in a trap of sorts. They cannot, so you find mega cities in the developing world that have networks of less than 100 kilometers of mass transit, for example, to serve 20 million people. They are part of the trap, and they cannot even maintain the local streets. So we argue that the underfinancing trap or underfunding trap is because, for several reasons, there is not enough revenue that can be directly or indirectly allocated to the transport system. Many times the enabling legislation is not good enough and doesn't allow municipalities to raise revenue, or national governments haven't realized that they have a role to play in financing sustainable transport. So this leads to the imbalance in investments, operation and maintenance, and revenue, and also there is a periodicity mismatch. Sometimes the sources do not match. For example, you build a BRT line, you need a lot of capital up front, or in about 3-4 years. But your sources are recurrent and do not raise much. You might need to access loans as a result, but your city might not have a credit rating or might not be eligible for loans. So that aggravates that mismatch in sense of time, aggravates the underfunding trap. Then we also have institutional complexity. We'll see the role for sustainable transport goes beyond the city or the metropolitan area itself. And then the result is low investment overall. Investment in capital, but also in maintenance. An asset that you don't maintain properly is an asset that then costs way more to maintain when you finally decide to maintain it. Now, another factor that contributes to the underfinancing trap are the implicit subsidies that cars receive. Let me begin by telling a small anecdote. Once I visited one of the client countries of the World Bank where I work, and somebody said at the local office, "Can you believe the local metro network receives 10 billion in local currency in subsidies a year? Isn't it outrageous? The public transport receives 10 billion in local currency a year in subsidies." And my response was, "And how much money do cars receive in subsidies?" "I don't know the answer," said my counterpart. Why? because subsidies for public transport are explicit. You can search on the internet and you will very likely find the different line items in the budget and add them up, and you get a very good idea of the subsidies that public transport is receiving in one way or another. Not all. As you can see in the figure, in the chart, some you cannot really find them. But cars, let's think of the subsidies that cars receive. Many of the cities I visit in the developing world, cars are parked on the sidewalk. That's a subsidy, terrible subsidy. The sidewalk is for pedestrians. Cars are not even paying, let alone for the cost of disrupting pedestrian flow. Fuel subsidies. And let's think of one of the most horrible costs that cars impose on others, congestion. Congestion is a cost, particularly on the people that travel by bus in mixed traffic, meaning the bus shares the street with the car. The cars, a bus with 70 people and cars with maybe, if you're lucky, 2 people, most likely 1, on average 1.3, 1.5 people per car, are congesting and imposing a cost on the bus. Congestion is therefore regressive, but it's a subsidy to the car. An implicit subsidy to the people in the car. Whereas the subsidies for public transport are explicit. So which ones are subject to political controversy? The ones for public transport, because you can find them, like my colleague, and said, isn't it outrageous that the metro system here receives 10 billion in local currency in subsidies? But the car, as net recipients of implicit subsidies, car users say, I want to continue with the status quo. I'm happy receiving subsidies. I don't realize, but my behavior reflects that I'm receiving subsidies instead of being charged. So we end up with this imbalance. We end up with private cars having a lot of political support because they move faster, because they receive implicit subsidies, the sign of status, and again the implicit subsidies. And of course you always have the pocket costs that all users have to pay. But what's the situation on the left for public transport? Many cities say stigma, or I won't let my children travel by public transport. I need to find a car for them, or a driver or something, but public transport is too dangerous, too bad in quality. Has explicit subsidies that again are subject to political controversy and are matter therefore of debate. Whereas the implicit subsidies for cars, the controversy is much more difficult because they are implicit. Now, on to the analytical framework that we develop in the book. Only 4 pages, that analytical framework. The book is incredibly short on purpose to increase, hopefully, readability. So if you benefit, you pay. That's the central pillar, or who benefits pays. Because we're used to thinking in terms of charging for using a road, user charges. Yes, that's part of if you benefit, you pay, or who benefits pays principle. But because the users benefit, they are the direct beneficiary. But there are also general beneficiaries, such as the country itself. Countries benefit from having sustainable and competitive cities. And public transport, for one, is very important to achieve a sustainable and competitive city, to make the labor market work, for example. And also there are indirect beneficiaries, real estate developers, advertisers, and so on and so forth. They also benefit in an indirect way. So the principle says, look at your, for example, cost-benefit analysis, where you identify different beneficiaries, among others, that's one source to identify the beneficiaries, and say, well, if you benefit, you have to contribute to this project because you're benefiting. So we're changing the structure from, let's say, user charges or no charge at all and just subsidy for all, capital investment and operation, to something, if you benefit, you pay. The second part of the framework calls for wiser investments. And wiser investments are particularly public transport projects. So let me give the example of a BRT system that is very well known internationally, Transmilenio, in my hometown of Bogota. And let me link the wiser investment with the idea of the if you benefit, you pay. Phase one of Transmilenio, 42 kilometers, 99% of the cost was borne by Bogota, by the finances of the city of Bogota. 1% or less by the national government of Colombia. Phase two, the equation is reversed, not entirely, but the national government of Colombia says, this is a good project, it's a wise investment, it's sustainable transport. It's actually even reducing the overall deficit because it concentrates travel on specific corridors, it's very efficient. With a fraction of the bus fleet, you move a ton of people, as Transmilenio in Bogota is doing, which moves 2.6 million trips a day on a network of 110 kilometers or so, more or less, approximate figures. And in phase two, the government of Colombia said, I want to pitch in. I want to pay part of phase two and phase three. And then the government of Colombia said, but wait, I need to not only invest in Bogota. So with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, the government of Colombia financed a series of cities, the five main cities, to build BRT projects and undertake ancillary reforms to try to create better incentives in the public transport system and generate better quality. It shows then wise investments can attract funding because it shows that if you benefit, you pay. National governments do have a role, and that's why we have in countries like Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, France, Germany, and the United States, among others, national or federal programs to support public transport above all. Most of all of those programs support above all public transport. It's very difficult to find one of those programs that supports urban roads, interestingly enough, because of the two principles I just explained. Now, we need to also improve the structure to address the periodicity issue. For example, making cities able to borrow, to get loans, to finance the capital investment, which is a one-shot or over 3 years, but it's a big investment over a short period of time, and then develop the tools. For example, the property tax. The property tax, as I will present later on, will emerge as a critical tool for financing local streets, for example. And here is, in a nutshell, our framework, how to escape the underfinancing trap. So on the left, you see the innovative financing structure that increase revenue, but above all, manage better the if you benefit, you pay principle to say, what are because the financing mechanisms, as I will present, we split them by type of beneficiary, general beneficiary, direct beneficiary, and indirect one. The funding mechanisms match the beneficiaries, so they can contribute and they can pay. And some incentives some financing mechanisms, beg your pardon, have the potential to change behavior, specifically user charges. Of course, abandoning the implicit subsidies, and charging for the use of cars, for example. And then on the right, you have the idea again of the wise investments. The implicit subsidy that cars receive, an urban expressway that, for example, does not charge at all, it's not a wise investment because it's promoting urban sprawl, it's promoting an excessive use of the car, it's promoting cars congesting and hurting buses in mixed traffic. So wise investments create, in general, more benefits than costs, particularly in the long term. And they tend to help reduce the deficit and therefore escape the underfinancing trap. Now, on to the analysis of 24 financing mechanisms, which is what we look at in the book. And we assess the quality, the convenience, the pros and cons of each of these 24 financing mechanisms by using a set of financial sustainability indicators. For example, does it cost more to administer that revenue source than the revenue it generates? Then it's not a good source of revenue. You better abandon it. You want sources of revenue that have a low administrative cost. But in political terms, the same happens. we will see, as I present the different mechanisms, that they're wonderful sources, but they need a lot of political homework. Mayors and planners need to assemble a very good coalition of support to get some of these mechanisms in place. And also, we look at how these financing mechanisms address transport sustainability. Specifically, do they promote better behavior? Do they promote less carbon footprint, in other words, but when you travel? Social equity, the regressiveness of congestion, for example. Do the mechanisms address that element? And the environmental impact. So let me walk you through the first set of results. This table looks complex because it is because it synthesizes a myriad of dimensions in basically a matrix. So we're looking at general beneficiaries, like the national government, the planet itself. I will explain why the planet is here included as a general beneficiary as we look at some of the financing mechanisms. So we're looking at general beneficiaries. The left column shows the financing instrument, subsidies, I will explain a little bit, property tax, national and international loans, like the ones the World Bank or other multilateral banks offer, carbon market, global environmental facility. The GF does finance urban transport. And one reason is that they are a general beneficiary. They represent the entire planet. And they say, I want to reduce, that financing mechanisms has the view that we want to reduce the carbon footprint of urban transport by promoting public transport and sustainable transport. Same with the Clean Technology Fund. The second column shows the revenue level. It's like the signals in the sign for how good your signal is in a cell phone. The more bars that are shaded, the better the revenue source. So we can see that the property tax is actually quite good. PPPs are also an interesting source. And let's briefly talk about why we included public transport subsidies. Public transport in general requires subsidies for capital investment. It's impossible to recover from the fares, the investment in the capital of a BRT or a metro. But also some operational subsidies might be needed. Fares might not be enough. But then there are good subsidies and bad subsidies. In that regard, we argue in favor of what we call demand-side subsidies, meaning transfer to the user, to the passenger, the subsidy, the money to use public transport, hopefully using a smart card and not cash. Because in some countries we've seen that the passengers for public transport receive a cash subsidy and they buy a motorcycle. And motorcycles have a lot of externalities, particularly on accidents, unless they behave like a car. But if they behave like the typical motorcycle, quite dangerous. So subsidies for public transport are justified demand side and for capital investment. And our analysis shows that the property tax is very important. Let's look at the other columns as we explain the property tax. It's very stable, has a very decent public acceptability, although you get revolts like you've seen in California and other states, for example, in the United States, that have limited the scope of property tax. We don't want that. It's fairly easy to administer. Let me give you an example precisely from Bogota. There is a World Bank project there, the Bogota Urban Services, that helped the city of Bogota improve the cadastre system, the basic registry of properties and how much they're worth. And Bogota now has a world-class cadastre system. Before that reform, the cadastre would erode. The property value would not be updated regularly, and the value would erode. So every 8 years, the property tax system was outdated. The cadastre was outdated, and therefore the revenue from the property tax was very low. But cities now, as I said, like Bogota and Washington, many other cities in the world, the maximum number of years that the cadastre is out of date is 1 year. Every year the cadastre gets updated. And this reform in Bogota was possible because the national government also enacted a law that allowed for a modern cadastre management system. And Bogota now has one, and the property tax is not only, again, one of the main sources of revenue, but it's also stable in time. It continues to raise revenue. Now, the efficiency, no, for promoting good behavior and less driving and so on, the property tax doesn't achieve that goal. That's why we gave it a red light here. Not very good. But as a source of revenue, again, think of local streets, think of sidewalks. Let's think like an economist. Can you build expressway? Can you exclude whoever doesn't want to use the urban expressway? Yes, that's why you should charge at all. But can you exclude whoever doesn't want to pay for using the sidewalk or the local street? No, you cannot exclude that user. And also, sidewalks and local streets are fundamental for the city to work. So the property tax, you see, I'm pairing up financing mechanism beneficiary with parts of the transport system. And precisely the column on cost says property tax is very good for financing capital investments, maintenance, and operation. So in a nutshell, and in periodicity, it's recurrent. So in a nutshell, we have in the table, because I will present two more of these tables, the name of the instrument for the category of beneficiary, general in this case, the revenue level using the idea of the signal in a cell phone, then the financial sustainability, the first three columns, stability, public acceptance, and administrative ease. The transport sustainability, efficiency, does it promote better behavior? Equity, reduces congestion, which is regressive, for example, and environmental impact, carbon footprint. Then, what part of the cost column is, can it finance maintenance, operation, and capital? What parts can it finance? And then finally, the periodicity. So as you can see, each table condenses, I don't know how many dimensions, like 12 or so, in a matrix. Let's move on to direct beneficiaries. And I want to flip back, because pay attention to the red and green and yellow dots, like a traffic light. I'm going to flip back, and now notice, particularly on the transport sustainability columns, what happens? Many more green dots. Because, let's begin with that part when we talk about direct beneficiaries. This is what we also call user charges. So we have parking charges, road pricing, congestion charging, fuel taxes, vehicle taxation, fare box revenue, and PPPs for urban roads, different than PPPs for public transport in the previous chart. A lot of green dots. Yes, charging users of cars, for example, promotes efficiency, lowers the carbon footprint. It's equitable because it reduces congestion that affects above all the buses in mixed traffic. That are a large chunk of the demand in cities in developing countries, even those that have fairly well-developed BRT networks and fairly well-developed metro networks, buses in mixed traffic continue to move a significant share of the public transport demand. So when congestion affects those buses, a lot of people are hurt. Charging those users of the road infrastructure, of cars in particular, for their use and for the benefit they get, promotes efficiency, promotes good behavior. But now, let's look at the financial sustainability aspects. The three columns on the left under financial sustainability. And you see a lot of red dots. Transport economics has for decades argued we need user charges, we need better parking structure, we need to charge the users of the transport system. They're consuming, those users are consuming too many roads, are traveling too much. It's not sustainable, they generate exaggerated congestion. However, very few cities have managed to enact actual congestion charging scheme. You can count them in one hand, probably, with the fingers of one hand. 11? Oh, you need, the toes. Okay, somebody's telling me here that you need both hands and one toe. Okay, good. Good news, it's increasing, but it's politically difficult. Now, what do we mean with the table? Do we say the mayor and the mayor's advisors do not undertake this beautiful, look at the revenue potential. It's huge. It's a huge revenue potential there from directly charging the users that also benefit from using the transport infrastructure. No, we're telling mayors and planners, do your political homework. You need to build a coalition. Probably you need to start through parking charges. Stop charging, let's use Washington as an example of an unsustainable parking structure. First 2 hours, $14. Parking all day, $20. Wrong. It promotes travel during the peaks, $20 for parking all day, and it dissuades parking of people who come to shop and do business in the area. You need the exact opposite. You need $2 for the first 2 hours and maybe $80 if you travel on the peaks. But should those $80 go entirely to the owner of the parking facility? No. They should be shared with the city government. Easier said than done. That's why it doesn't happen. That's why the parking fee structure is the opposite of what we want for sustainable transport, the exact opposite more often than not. And the political homework. The political homework. But there is fantastic revenue here, huge benefits in terms of efficiency, equity, and environmental impact. But the political homework. Again, we are not saying do not undertake, do not work, do not make an effort to try to get parking charges changed, road pricing, congestion pricing. No, we're saying there is a political homework to do because the revenue is very interesting. It's a huge source of revenue that hasn't been tapped for the most part. I once presented this same research in one country client of the World Bank, and somebody came after me and told me, I pay $25 a year in registration fees and all vehicle charges, $25 for a car. And I used to think that it was exaggerated cost to pay $25 for the right of owning a car. Gladly, that person told me that thanks to this presentation had seen that probably he should be paying $2,500 a year because he realized the cost and the benefit he's receiving and said, change completely. One by one, maybe we need to convince. Now on to indirect beneficiaries. So here we have employers, urban developers, real estate interests, and so on. We have a series of, from advertising to tax increment financing, special assessment or valorization in other contexts it's called. From Spanish, it's been translated into English, valorización, valorization, special assessment, transport utility fees, so on. Many are under the heading of value capture. Again, a very interesting source of revenue. But, the political aspect is also difficult. Again, the lesson is, mayors and planners, if you want to do special assessments, very interesting. Betterment levies. Sorry, I was confusing. Betterment levies is what is equivalent to valorization. Apologies. Betterment levies, very important source of financing. But you need to do a political homework. You need to build a coalition. You need to explain. And also, when you do value capture, please do not hurt the property tax. Let's use again the city of Bogota. The book doesn't mention Bogota or any other city. It's like a white paper. But as part of this research, we also analyzed in depth the finances of the Bogota transport system overall. And we have, it's a public paper. We presented at the World Conference on Transport Research some years ago. So I'm using those examples. Bogota, a previous mayor, tried to, in parallel, enact a very large betterment levy and an update to the property tax, to the cadastre system. And there was a political revolt. And the coalition against, because people were saying, wait a minute, you're charging me more on the property tax because you're updating the cadastre, the property values. And you're also now telling me to pay an additional contribution for some projects that you will build that will benefit me, but my income is not growing. So I have to pay more, and my income will grow at a different rate. So the coalition against found the property tax to be the weakest link. And the update to the cadastre fell through, had to be canceled. But the betterment levy was enacted. Years later, a different mayor was able to update the cadastre. Interestingly enough, the betterment levy didn't work as expected. That mayor also had to return some of the revenue the city had collected because the works were not undertaken. But again, value capture, very good. Do your political homework and do not hurt other sources of municipal finance like the property tax. As long as those are met, please, by all means, build your coalition of support. Betterment levies, tax increment financing, great sources of revenue, but a lot of political homework to do. And again, on the task, maintenance, operation, capital, so you see the different parts of the transport system. Here is another representation of what each financing mechanism can finance. So we divided the transport system in 7 parts, from urban highways, non-motorized and public transport, traffic management, and ITS. That's increasingly important. Many cities I work in have traffic light networks that have a fraction of lights working properly and have a fraction of the overall traffic lights the city needs. So when you don't have even the basic pillar of ITS, which is traffic lights, working properly, you can expect your congestion to be a little bit higher than it should be. But again, many cities need to learn about ITS above all by managing better the traffic light network. So you can see from general beneficiaries, loans and grants, global environmental facility can finance several parts. Now let's see what happens when you go to direct beneficiaries. Let me go back, and again, you see even more parts. The longer the number of bars on the chart, the better that financing instrument in that category of beneficiary, we're looking now at direct beneficiaries, is to finance different parts of the transport system. Again, direct beneficiaries, the financing instruments related to direct beneficiaries are a very good source for the entire system, for maintenance, for capital investments, for ITS, for everything, every part, from the sidewalk to the subway. And then the indirect beneficiaries. Here, not as good, but not bad, not bad. It can finance a lot of public transport. As you can see, all the elements here are good for financing sustainable transport. Non-motorized and public transport is the green bar. So all of these instruments are a source. And again, apply the principle, if you benefit, you pay. If you benefit somewhat, you should contribute to financing sustainable transport. Urban highways, interestingly enough, don't appear as much in the chart. Interestingly enough, if you pay attention, sustainable transport seems to be able to tap more financing mechanisms. So on to the conclusions. Transport planning and urban planning are linked. As I was saying, implicit subsidies for cars spread the urban area, contribute to sprawl, for example. So link them. Apply the who benefits pays principle. If you benefit, you pay. Change therefore the financing structure from just finding, if I build a BRT, then what can I do? No, step back, look at the benefits, look at the local legislation, and see what of the financing mechanisms we describe in the book are available in the legislation, and see how you can tap them, how you can make a contribution to the financing structure instead of saying, oh, all I need is international loans. And no, step back and think more carefully the overall financing structure along the lines of who benefits pays principle. Third point, wise investments. Again, what is not a wise investment? An urban expressway that does not charge users, that does not have a toll. Hopefully a higher toll during peak hours than during the off-peak hours. That is an unwise investment. Public transport, it's a very wise investment in general, of course, good feasibility study, good demand analysis, so that you don't end up with a metro line with 10,000 users a day. Properly undertaken and prepared public transport projects are wise investments. Subsidies are important for capital, for example. That's why national governments tend to, above all in their programs, subsidize capital investments. But also, as I was saying, there are subsidies for the user. Or if they have to be to operators, then in exchange, if they have to be supply-side subsidies to the operator of the bus, let's say, then try to generate better behavior, better service in exchange for the subsidy. Frequently we see explicit subsidies for bus operators in exchange for just the basic service. We advocate to, one, improve the structure of those subsidies to generate better behavior, and hopefully raise fares a little bit to a level where most people can pay, and switch to a demand-side subsidy so that those who really need the subsidy, the very poor, actually get the subsidy. When you have lower fares, people that shouldn't be getting the subsidy and could pay are getting the subsidy. So subsidies also need some changes. Property tax. National governments here have a role, on the one hand, to allow, to improve legislation. For example, the use of hedonic pricing to update the cadastre. Instead of having to be an inspector that looks room by room, that is for a sample of the properties. I'm summarizing the reform in Bogota. Before, it used to be a person had to go property by property, or people could self-assess. But the inspection, the update was through physical inspection. Now that's a part of the update. The rest is through hedonic pricing models that Colombian legislation allowed. So those hedonic models run equations and the cadastre gets updated. Washington, D.C. updates its cadastre in the same way. That's modern cadastre management. And it's a very good source of revenue. Think about sidewalks and local streets. Think of them as in terms of the benefit they provide. I like in this part of my presentation to refer to Eduardo Vasconcelos' book on transport equity and environment. Forget the exact title, apologies. But he describes how as a child he used to play soccer in the streets of Sao Paulo. And now it's congestion. Children cannot play because congestion has become pervasive and regressive. That's why local streets provide a general benefit, because above all, I think, we can see them together with the sidewalks as an extended park, the local streets, that are for some cars to go through, some buses, but above all, for pedestrians and children. National governments, they have a role to play because they benefit. Because national governments benefit from having cities that work, where the urban labor market works. And therefore, they should contribute. I was referring to the examples of Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, France, Germany, the United States, among others, that have national or federal programs to support sustainable transport at the city level. And now, the political reality. User charges, we need to introduce them gradually. And we need to do the political homework of getting support for congestion charging, parking fees, and so on. Value capture, a very important source of revenue, but again, with a big political task ahead. Can you do it? Of course. Cities have done it. Value capture is a very interesting mechanism, but please do not hurt other key municipal finance mechanisms such as the property tax. If you get a trade-off, analyze it carefully. If more betterment levies raised here and less property tax here, be careful. Because one is recurrent and the other one is, the betterment levy is a one-shot. Be careful. Huge source, but precisely for that, assess, work in political terms. So in a nutshell, if you benefit, you pay, and wiser investments. Because we want to go from unsustainable transport, as you see in the left slide, to sustainable transport, to quality public transport. And we want, above all, to have a public transport that has the political support, that has the status. People are proud of the public transport system. That, yes, receives explicit subsidies. Public transport needs them, as I explained. Of course, the fares are an important source of revenue. But the change important here is also in cars. Cars continue to be people proud of their car, fine. But user charges. From implicit subsidies, we need to move, hopefully one day, to user charges. And of course, their pocket costs. So thank you, and let's open up the discussion.